In this lesson, you will learn about the instrument flight rules. Expressed simply, the instrument flight rules, commonly referred to as IFR, are a set of rules for flights during which it cannot be assumed that pilots will be able to navigate their aircraft or maintain separation from obstacles, terrain, and other aircraft by reference to features outside the cockpit. So, in general terms, instrument flight rules exist to ensure that a pilot has adequate clearance from ground obstacles and that his aircraft is safely separated from other aircraft in the vertical plane. For flight in accordance with the instrument flight rules, navigation and obstacle clearance must be able to be maintained by sole reference to the aircraft's instruments. And under the instrument flight rules, separation of aircraft from other air traffic is provided either by pilots receiving an air traffic control service or by aircraft flying at specified flight levels depending on their magnetic track over the ground. You should note that whereas all flights which take place in instrument meteorological conditions must be conducted in accordance with the instrument flight rules, flight under the instrument flight rules may also take place in visual meteorological conditions. Instrument flight rules are, as their name makes clear, a set of rules governing the conduct of an aircraft in flight. The instrument flight rules are quite independent of the prevailing meteorological conditions. So even though the instrument flight rules assume that separation from terrain and other aircraft can not be maintained by reference to features outside the cockpit, and that the aircraft is being operated by sole reference to its instruments, the instrument flight rules may still be followed or imposed even in visual meteorological conditions. In fact, most commercial air transport flights within Europe and the United States are under continuous air traffic control, and therefore operate within controlled airspace under instrument flight rules for the whole flight, irrespective of whether visual meteorological conditions or instrument meteorological conditions prevail. Now that you have learnt about the concept of instrument flight rules, let's pass on to the rules themselves. Here they are, as contained in Chapter 5 of Annex 2 to the Convention on International Civil Aviation. Scroll through the instrument flight rules and note that they take up scarcely more than one page. When referring to Annex 2 for operational or examination purposes, always ensure that you consult the very latest version of the Annex. In order to be able to fly in accordance with the instrument flight rules, aircraft must be equipped with suitable instruments and with navigation equipment appropriate to the route to be flown. Flight in accordance with the instrument flight rules must not be conducted at a level which is below the minimum flight altitude for IFR flight established by the nation whose territory is being overflown. Where a nation has not established a minimum IFR flight altitude, the ICAO minimum level rules apply. These are that an aircraft flying in accordance with the instrument flight rules over mountainous areas or high terrain is to remain at least 2,000 feet or 600 meters above the highest obstacle located within 8 kilometers of the estimated position of the aircraft. Elsewhere than over high terrain or mountainous areas, IFR flights are to remain at least 1,000 feet or 300 meters above the highest obstacle located within 8 kilometers of the estimated position of the aircraft. For the purpose of adhering to the IFR minimum level rules, the estimated position of the aircraft must take account of the navigational accuracy which can be achieved on the relevant route segment, having regard to the navigational facilities available in the aircraft and on the ground. Pilots should note that IFR minimum level rules do not absolve them from the necessity to adhere at all times to the overall minimum height rule, which stipulates that an aircraft must not be flown over congested areas or over an open-air assembly of persons below a height that, in the event of an emergency arising, would enable the aircraft to make a landing without undue hazard to persons or property on the surface. The only exceptions to all the minimum level rules just mentioned are when an aircraft is taking off or landing, or when specifically authorized to descend below the established minimum levels by the appropriate authority. In the lesson on the visual flight rules, you learnt about the rules governing the procedure for changing from VFR flight to IFR flight. You will not be surprised to learn that similar rules exist to cover the situation where a pilot wishes to, or is obliged to, change from the instrument flight rules to the visual flight rules. If he has submitted a flight plan, a pilot who elects to change the conduct of his flight from compliance with the instrument flight rules to compliance with the visual flight rules must tell the appropriate air traffic services unit that the IFR flight plan is cancelled and communicate to that air traffic services unit the changes to be made to the existing flight plan. When the pilot of an aircraft operating under the instrument flight rules wishes to cancel his IFR flight plan because he has encountered visual meteorological conditions, he must not cancel the IFR flight plan unless he anticipates and intends that the flight will be continued for a reasonable period of time in uninterrupted visual meteorological conditions. When operating in accordance with the instrument flight rules in controlled airspace, the IFR flight is known as a controlled flight, and an air traffic control clearance is required for the flight to take place. The required air traffic control clearance is requested by the pilot by submitting a flight plan to the appropriate air traffic services unit. When operating in controlled airspace, IFR flights must comply with air traffic control instructions and with all the sections of Rule of the Air 3.6. Rule of the Air 3.6 deals with controlled flights, air traffic services, air traffic control clearances, adherence to flight plans, and communications. Rule of the Air 3.6 is covered by separate lessons in this CBT course. Unless otherwise instructed by air traffic control or approved in an ATC clearance, when an aircraft operating in accordance with the instrument flight rules is in cruising flight within controlled airspace, the aircraft is to be flown at a cruising flight level dependent on the aircraft's magnetic track over the ground. An indication of the correlation between cruising flight levels and magnetic track for IFR flight is shown on screen here. Note that different cruising flight levels are allocated for IFR and VFR flights. The rule governing the correlation between cruising levels and magnetic track is semicircular in nature, because approximately half of the allocated flight levels are for aircraft in the cruise on magnetic tracks from 0 degrees to 179 degrees, while the remaining allocated flight levels are for aircraft in the cruise on magnetic tracks from 180 degrees to 359 degrees. The semicircular nature of this rule is illustrated here. You can see that from 0 to 179 degrees, IFR cruising levels are at odd-numbered flight levels, while from 180 to 359 degrees, the IFR cruising levels are even-numbered flight levels. If an aircraft is authorized to employ cruise climb techniques between flight levels, the higher flight level at which the aircraft levels off must also be in compliance with this so-called semicircular rule. The cruising levels that we have just illustrated are to give you merely an idea of the full table of cruising levels. That table is contained at Appendix 3 to Annex 2 of the ICAO Convention on International Civil Aviation. Be sure to refer to Annex 2 in order to study the details of this rule. We show an extract from Appendix 3 to ICAO Annex 2 here. Be sure, though, to refer to the latest edition of Annex 2 when using the table for operational or examination purposes. The cruising flight level rule that you have just learnt about also applies to IFR flights operating in uncontrolled airspace, except when otherwise specified by the appropriate Air Traffic Services Authority for flight at or below 3,000 feet above mean sea level. An aircraft operating in accordance with the instrument flight rules outside controlled airspace is not always obliged to maintain an air-ground voice communication watch with an Air Traffic Services unit. However, if outside controlled airspace, but within advisory airspace, or when otherwise so required by the appropriate Air Traffic Services Authority, an IFR flight is to maintain an air-ground voice communication watch on the appropriate communication channel and establish two-way communication as necessary with the Air Traffic Services unit. This situation is amplified by the rules of the air shown on screen here. The pilot of an IFR flight operating outside controlled airspace, but who is required by the appropriate Air Traffic Services Authority to submit a flight plan and to maintain an air-ground voice communication watch with an Air Traffic Services unit, for instance, an IFR flight within advisory airspace, is required to report his position as specified in Rule of the Air 3.6.3, applicable to controlled flights. That completes the lesson on the instrument flight rules. The general rules of the air are contained in Chapter 3 of Annex 2 to the ICAO Convention. You can see the contents of Chapter 3 here. Of the principal rules of the air headings that you see, the most important will be covered by separate lessons in this Rules of the Air section of the Air Law CBT course. But before taking your examination in air law, make sure that you read through Chapter 3 for yourself and satisfy yourself that you are familiar with its details. In this lesson, we will cover the rules of the air dealing with minimum height, cruising levels, and avoidance of collisions, both in the air and on the ground. The first part of Chapter 3, Annex 2, deals with the protection of persons and property. As you see, the key statement here is that an aircraft is not to be operated in a negligent or reckless manner so as to endanger the life or property of others. One of the central tenets of this rule is that there is a minimum height below which aircraft may not be flown. The ICAO minimum height rule states that, except where necessary for takeoff or landing, or except when express permission is given by the appropriate authority, an aircraft may not be flown over the congested areas of cities, towns, or settlements, or over an open-air gathering of people, unless the aircraft is at such a height that will permit it, in the event of an emergency arising, to make a landing without causing undue hazard to persons and property on the ground. This general minimum height rule should not be confused with the minimum specified height rules applied to IFR or VFR flight. You have learnt about minimum heights for VFR and IFR flight in the previous two lessons. But because aircraft are always flying in accordance with either the instrument flight rules or the visual flight rules, you may ask yourself how you reconcile those rules with the general minimum height rule just quoted. The answer is straightforward. The minimum height we can fly is that which satisfies both the general rule and the rules that apply to our type of flight, that is, VFR or IFR, except, of course, for the purpose of takeoff and landing, or with authority permission to do otherwise. Now let's move on to the question of cruising levels. You should note here that the word level used generally in air law refers to height, altitude, or flight levels. However, in this lesson, we will be talking about either altitudes on the one hand or flight levels on the other. In order to meet air traffic and flight safety requirements, national aviation authorities establish one or more transition altitudes in the state or states for which they are responsible. At or below the relevant transition altitude, the vertical position of an aircraft in the cruise is monitored and reported by reference to altitude. Altitude is measured with respect to the local sea level pressure setting, which is known throughout the world of aviation as QNH. Over countries whose topography includes high ground and mountains, the transition altitude will be higher than over a low-lying country. For example, in the United Kingdom, the transition altitude is generally 3,000 feet, with certain exceptions such as around Heathrow and Glasgow. In the United States, though, the transition altitude over most of the country is 18,000 feet, while in New Zealand, the transition altitude is 13,000 feet. Above the relevant transition altitude, the air traffic services monitor and pilots report the vertical cruising position of aircraft by reference to flight levels. Flight levels are measured with respect to a standard pressure setting of 1013.2 hectopascal or millibars. The lowest usable flight level above the transition altitude is called the transition level. You should note that while a transition altitude is set by a national aviation authority, transition levels are not fixed, but change with changing atmospheric pressure. So, on a given day, the transition level might be flight level 45, for instance, as shown here, or, as in this example, flight level 40. The phenomenon of changing values for the transition level can be awkward to understand. You should take time to study the phenomenon on your own by referring to the lesson on altimetry in the subject of meteorology. Now let's move on to avoidance of collision. In all aircraft operations, it is of supreme importance that rules be established to help keep the risk of collision between aircraft to an absolute minimum, whether the aircraft are in the air or on the ground. When aircraft are under radar control and flying in accordance with the instrument flight rules, collision avoidance is the responsibility of the air traffic controller as well as that of the pilot. And so the rules of the air on collision avoidance may seem to apply predominantly to aircraft flying in accordance with the visual flight rules. Nevertheless, collision avoidance rules must be observed and put into practice by all pilots. It is crucial that flight crew never relax their vigilance in seeking to avoid collisions between aircraft in flight, regardless of the type of flight, or of the class of airspace in which the aircraft is operating. Vigilance of flight crew on the ground is also of great importance. One of the most fundamental rules of collision avoidance is the proximity rule. That rule states that an aircraft is not to be operated in such proximity to other aircraft as to create a collision hazard. This, of course, is the reason why aircraft are not to be flown in formation, except by prearrangement between the pilots in command of the aircraft taking part in the flight. If the formation flight is to take place in controlled airspace, the flight must be in accordance with the conditions prescribed by the appropriate air traffic services authorities. It is in order to help ensure that collisions between aircraft do not occur that rules concerning rights of way have been established. In all rules pertaining to right of way, the aircraft which has the right of way maintains its heading and speed. However, it is crucial that pilots understand that no right-of-way rule relieves the pilot in command of an aircraft having the right-of-way from the responsibility of taking avoiding action should it prove necessary. The pilot of the aircraft required to give way may not have seen the other aircraft. It can easily be fatal in the air for a pilot to insist on his priority. It is incumbent on all pilots to take action to avoid collision. This principle includes action to avoid collision based on resolution advisories provided by ACAS equipment. ACAS is the Airborne Collision Avoidance System, equipment that seeks to warn pilots of the proximity of other aircraft. The remainder of this lesson deals with specific rules of the air from Chapter 3 of ICAO Annex 2, which pertain to avoidance of collision and rights of way. An aircraft which is obliged by the rules which follow to keep out of the way of another aircraft must avoid passing over, under, or in front of the other aircraft unless passing well clear. Aircraft taking avoiding action must also take into account the effect of wake turbulence. If two aircraft are approaching head-on and there is a danger of collision, both aircraft are to alter heading to the right. It is generally accepted that anything within the sector 20 degrees either side of dead ahead is head-on. This is particularly important nowadays as navigation equipment is so accurate that it will place aircraft exactly on the center line of airways. All it takes is an incorrect flight level assignment or poor height keeping, and a head-on situation is much more likely to occur than it used to be. When two aircraft of the same category, for instance, two powered heavier-than-air aircraft, are converging at approximately the same level, the aircraft which has the other aircraft on its right is to give way. Expressed simplistically, the aircraft on the right is in the right and should maintain speed and heading. Where the converging aircraft are not of the same category, being on the right does not automatically give that aircraft the right of way. In the case of different categories of aircraft, the following right-of-way rules apply. Power-driven heavier-than-air machines are to give way to airships, balloons, and gliders. Power-driven lighter-than-air machines, for instance airships, are to give way to gliders and balloons. Gliders are to give way to balloons. Power-driven aircraft are to give way to aircraft which are towing other aircraft or objects. Here is a summary of the right-of-way rules in the air when aircraft are converging. Never insist on your right-of-way. Even if you have the right-of-way, always be prepared to take avoiding action yourself if the other aircraft does not. Now let's look at the situation of overtaking. An overtaking aircraft is a faster aircraft that approaches another aircraft from behind, within a 70-degree arc either side of the tail of the aircraft being overtaken. At night, the overtaking aircraft in this position would be unable to see either of the other aircraft's port or starboard navigation lights. It is the aircraft which is being overtaken that has the right of way. The overtaking aircraft, whether climbing, descending, or in horizontal flight, must keep out of the way of the other aircraft by altering its heading to the right. The overtaking aircraft must stay out of the way of the aircraft being overtaken until well clear. Furthermore, the pilot of the overtaking aircraft should take into account the wake turbulence which might possibly affect his own aircraft or the aircraft being overtaken during the overtaking maneuver. Now let's move on to the question of priority on landing. An aircraft in flight or operating on the ground or water is required to give way to aircraft landing or in the final stages of an approach to land. When two or more heavier than air aircraft are approaching an aerodrome for the purpose of landing, aircraft at the higher level must give way to aircraft at the lower level. But the lower aircraft must not take advantage of this rule to cut in front of another aircraft which is in the final stages of an approach to land, or to overtake that aircraft. In any event, power-driven heavier than air aircraft are to give way to gliders. An aircraft whose pilot is aware that another aircraft is compelled to land because of an emergency must give way to that aircraft. Let's pass now to the issue of priority on takeoff. An aircraft taxiing on the maneuvering area of an aerodrome must give way to aircraft taking off or about to take off. Chapter 3 also contains rules governing the surface movement of aircraft. An aircraft taxiing on the maneuvering area must stop and hold at all runway holding positions, unless otherwise authorized by air traffic control. Likewise, an aircraft taxiing on the maneuvering area must stop and hold at all lighted stop bars, such as those shown here at a taxiway intersection. The aircraft may proceed further only when the lights are switched off. If there is any danger of collision between two aircraft taxiing, the following collision avoidance rules apply. When two aircraft are approaching head-on, or approximately so, each aircraft must stop, or, where practicable, alter its course to the right, so as to keep well clear. When two aircraft which are taxiing are converging, the one which has the other on its right must give way. Any aircraft which is being overtaken by another aircraft has the right of way. The overtaking aircraft must keep well clear of the aircraft being overtaken. That completes the lesson on minimum height, cruising levels, and avoidance of collisions.
The systems of displaying aeroplane, navigation and anti-collision lights, or any other lights designed to draw attention to the presence of an aeroplane, are covered in other lessons. But you may be asked questions on the subject in the ATPL Air Law exam. To this end, Air Law restricts itself to when you must have the lights fitted and when they must be on. From sunset to sunrise, as defined by the authority, aeroplanes are to be illuminated with anti-collision lights, intended to attract attention to the aeroplane. Additionally, navigation lights that define the relative path of the aeroplane are to be displayed. No other light can be shown if it is likely to be mistaken for these lights. If aeroplanes have anti-collision lights fitted, they should be on by day as well. Aeroplanes should not land specifically for the purpose of repairing broken anti-collision lights. From sunset to sunrise, all aeroplanes moving on the movement area shall display navigation lights that indicate the relative path of the aeroplane. All aeroplanes on the movement area shall display lights that define the extremities of their structure, unless stationary and otherwise adequately illuminated. Aeroplanes parked on an apron will be adequately illuminated because the apron is required to be lit at night. Away from an apron, aeroplanes must be lit. All aeroplanes on the movement area of an aerodrome are to display lights that attract the attention of other aeroplanes. Aeroplanes with engines running are to display lights to indicate the fact. Red anti-collision lights suffice for this purpose. In fact, it is usual to switch on the anti-collision lights when an aircraft is manned to indicate the fact and serve to warn that the engine may be started. A pilot is permitted to switch off or dim the intensity of any flashing light if they are likely, in his opinion, to adversely affect the satisfactory performance of his duty, or subject an outside observer to harmful dazzle.